We have two speakers today, Mary Jo Herde and Al Tacker, who will share their Africa reflections. Mary Jo Herde, PhD, has worked in a variety of careers from the court system to nonprofit management to academia. Her wanderlust has taken her from extension work in the Missouri Boot Hill and New Hampshire to teaching English in China. Last month, her continuing desire to experience the world took her to Africa. Al Tacker, PhD, moved to Columbia from the East Coast in 1967 to pursue graduate work in geology. He quickly became active in the anti-war movement, city, and democratic politics. He has been involved in crisis center management, computer programming, market research, community radio at KOPN, and nonprofit management. He served 3 terms on Columbia City Council in the 1980s and retired in 2011 after 23 years as executive director of Family Counseling Center. Welcome, Mary Jo and Al.
Well, good afternoon. Last fall, we were looking at possibilities for, well, let me back up a minute. When Mary Jo and I got together about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, sorry, it's been a long time. I've been to 49 states, but I'd never been out of North America. Mary Jo still had a few states left, but she had been to Europe twice. So it was inevitable that we would travel as much as possible. And last fall, we saw an ad for a very inexpensive cruise to Africa. And sub-Saharan Africa really is the only major part of the world that we hadn't been to before. And it was very inexpensive. It was on a cruise line, Azamara, which is sort of a mid-sized cruise. But this was a repositioning cruise. The boat that flies the Caribbean in our summer, it goes around Southern Africa in their summer, our wintertime, and it was on its way down. And it has a capacity of 700 people, but only 500 signed up. So the remaining spots were very, very inexpensive. And we decided, hey, this is a place, this might be very difficult, but this is a place we always have kind of wanted to go. And so we did that. And what we're going to look at are some of the pictures of what we saw and some observations about them, and maybe just a little bit about Africa, because Africa is something that most people don't know too much about. And in fact, it was kind of amazing how difficult Mary Jo's been trying to do some research on Africa and what its issues are and what its problems are. And it's really hard to find stuff, even on the internet, about Africa. And I think the fact that so few people wanted to go to Africa on that cruise certainly helped us out, but also really emphasized the fact that there isn't a great deal of interest in doing that. So with that, let's see if we can share this. Can you see that?
Yes, we do.
Okay. It's the first time I've done this.
No, it's the second time, Al. Admit it.
Well, we did it a few minutes ago.
First time with an audience.
Right. There are 54 countries in Africa. It's a huge place. The distance between the top of Africa, I bet maybe we even see that, can't we? And the bottom is the same distance as the distance between Edmonton, which is in northern Alberta, and the northern tip of Chile. East to west, it's almost twice as wide as the United States. And even this narrower portion is greater than the distance between Colombia and Los Angeles. It's very diverse. The north is basically Arab influenced. It's an extension of the Middle East. It's Muslim. The West Africa area is the most populated one, and probably the one that we think of in terms of the larger countries, larger cities. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. Also includes places like Ghana, Liberia, Ivory Coast. And so this is really kind of a stereotype of Africa. But then there are the other stereotype is this area of Eastern Africa that's got all those famous African animals, and people say, "Did you see a lot of great animals?" And it's like, no, we saw flamingos. That was about it. And then this West Central Africa is the least populated, least developed area. And finally, South Africa, an area that was largely settled by the British and to some degree the Germans, and in a way is the most westernized and most developed part of Africa.
And there are, I tried to find out how many languages are spoken in Africa, because every place I turned, they referred to a different language or a different tribe. And I found several things, but between 1,500 and 2,000 languages, separate languages, are spoken in Africa, which is just amazing to me. Also, it has the greatest genetic diversity of any area in the world. And it's probably the area that's least taught in schools. I was trying to think back. Did you study about Africa when you were in high school and grade school very much? In my school, we didn't. We focused more on Europe. And so Al said it was an area we both wanted to go to. I will define that a little further, clarify it a little further. Al really wanted to visit Africa, and I am a very good wife. So.
Hey, Al, if you don't mind, could you switch to slideshow mode?
Yeah, I think.
You got it up there somewhere.
Oh, all right, there we are.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. A lot of Africa is desert. We think of jungles in Africa, but North Africa is the Sahara. Southern Africa is the Kalahari. And it's just kind of the area in between that's really a heavily African rainforest jungle type place. The places down here are the places that we went: the Canary Islands, Senegal, and the Gambia, Namibia, and South Africa. And we also went to St. Helena, which is a island way out there in the middle of the Atlantic that really isn't African at all, but it was kind of an interesting side trip. Started out in the Canary Islands, which has nothing to do with canaries, the bird. It comes from the Latin meaning island of the dogs. It's a province of Spain. It looks and feels like a lot like Spain, but it's off the coast of Morocco, and it's a semi-desert area. At least when we went in November, it was an inexpensive resort. It's in the off season, and it was a very pleasant place to visit.
A nice Trump getaway.
Getting away from, post-election. And actually, I might say the people on the ship mostly weren't Americans. They were mostly Canadians, Brits, some Australians, other Europeans. And even the Americans that were on there, the ones that were interested in Africa, ran into very, very few people who are at least vocally supportive of Trump, and a whole lot of people that shared our political viewpoint. So in that sense, it was a very nice vacation. Senegal and the Gambia are representative of West Africa. It's the source of the majority of the slaves. And incidentally, only 4% of slaves came to America, to the United States. Great majority of them in the Caribbean, and a lot in Brazil too, and South American countries. So I think we tend to think narrowly: slaves, Africa, U.S. That there's only 4% that came to the U.S. It's the most densely populated area of Africa: Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Liberia, as well as Senegal and Gambia.
You notice he's saying the Gambia. And I think that's interesting, because I always just thought it was Gambia, and we were corrected when you said Gambia. The name of the country is the Gambia.
And it's in the Gambian River Valley, and why it's I don't know, but they try to explain it, but I really couldn't get that. Senegal is considered to be the most tourist-friendly country in the region. The Amazing Race did an episode from Senegal, and I think that's the only place in Sub-Saharan Africa that they ever went. So our assumption going in, real strong feelings, but we assumed to be somewhat like the Caribbean, but more primitive, and that turned out to be basically accurate. What we saw are a lack of good quality permanent stores, permanent buildings with shopping, quite a bit of begging, really it's a lot of ramshackle housing and really dirty places too. I mean, a lot of litter and dirt and stuff like that. And so here, our first stop then is Dakar, Senegal, and it's a large city, over 1 million people. And there's your typical stereotype of the Atlantic coast there in Africa. A lot of the housing in Dakar or apartments. Some of them don't. These look like they're kind of crumbling, and they probably are. And one thing to notice, and this is really typical of third world countries, are the partial construction. It's very hard to get loans for construction, for real estate in much of the undeveloped world, and especially in Africa. So there are people living in these stories, and these are under construction. You accumulate the money and you build as you have it, and which is good because you don't go into debt, but it's a long process with a lot of vacancies in housing, a lot of empty area. These shots are from downtown Dakar, and I'm sorry I missed I shot that horse about a half a second too late, but he's there. But you see this person that's got a shop that's basically a tent, and some of these other buildings are not all that stable or permanent.
I think the thing that surprised me was that downtown stores were often like this rather than more, complete stores as we would imagine them.
More downtown shopping. This guy's obviously that's like Westlakes or Lowe's out there on the street, and then off to the left again a little shopping street in an area that's really close to downtown. And a couple more shots. Another shot of a neighborhood shopping district, and you can see they're basically again in, I guess, sort of modified tents. Sidewalks were poor. This was just outside, I believe, the med school or the university, and that was the quality of the sidewalk there. You can imagine what it's like in some of the other parts of town.
I was surprised that a city as well known as Dakar was in this kind of infrastructure shape. Kind of surprised me. They do have taller buildings, though. They're starting to build some of those. You can see that in the background.
There are some nice places, and these are the places that tend to be the tourist slots. On the west is Our Lady of Victory's Cathedral, and on the right is the African Renaissance Monument. And do you have some information about that?
I want to comment on the African Renaissance Monument because it was just built about 15 years ago, and it's really impressive. It's, as you can see, it's huge and it kind of towers over the city. But I think it's interesting to read the background on it. It was very controversial. It cost $27 million in a poor country, and there were protests in the street against it. It was supposedly designed by a Romanian, a Senegalese architect, but it turned out that the real architect was Romanian, and it was built by a North Korean company. So there was a lot of criticism of this. They also some felt like it was a little bit sexist, and that the man certainly is a stronger figure here than the woman. And it's just interesting because you see the monument, you think, oh boy, that's really impressive. And then you read about it and you realize that it was certainly a big controversy in Dakar.
Yeah. And they say there's a great view from the top, but we did not bother to climb up there to check that one out. So we moved from there down to the Gambia, and the Gambia is completely surrounded by Senegal. It's just in the river valley. Senegal is actually in the desert, or at least that part of Senegal. And Banjul is in a lush river valley. It's much smaller. It has less of an urban feel. And the housing is not as good as it is in Senegal. These are a couple of fairly representative residential streets. And we did not intentionally take pictures of the worst. We were trying to go for typical. Got a couple of really bad places, but what we have chosen to show are things that are not at all unusual in terms of how people are living. Both Tacker and Banjul were full of litter. You can see that in the street and also on the beach. Beautiful beach. It's just completely full of litter. But there's some cool places too. This is a park toward the center of town, which features a place where you can pet crocodiles, which you'll see over there on the right. And actually, one of us actually did pet crocodiles, but that was a video which I did not put on here. Yeah. But again, this is our impression of that part of Africa that's really the most populous and most representative in terms of urban Africa. And we've heard a lot about how things have improved. And so it's kind of shocking to realize that this is what things are looking like and feeling like after they've improved. It's really coming from a very, very poor place. Saint Helena, am I saying it right? Helena. We said Helena before, but it's Helena, is a British dependent territory, which is the new politically correct term for colony. It's way out in the Atlantic. It was 5 days by cruise ship from the Gambia. It's probably the most remote populated place in the world. It's not Africa. It's considered just to be in the middle of the Atlantic. It's a place where Napoleon was exiled. And you can imagine as he comes up, it looks like this. And he's saying, oh, no, this is really going to be bad. But actually, he got a pretty nice place up there in the center of the island. And we went up there, really, really pretty up in the mountains. The people of St. Helena, I would say, looked vaguely ethnic, a mix of European, Indian, African. The Indians and Africans, not sure if they were brought over as slaves and then servants or what, and there really doesn't seem to be much of a sense in the people living there what that background was. And certainly a lot of British in there, but they were extremely friendly. They were extremely helpful. We visited the Tourist Information Center on a Saturday afternoon at a time that normally they're closed, and they were just wonderful in terms of helping us find transportation up into the interior part of the island. Many of the people who live there have spent time in England, but they choose to return to a place that is tight and friendly and isn't as exciting, but a place that feels home.
I was talking to some young adults and they told me they didn't drive cars, and I was kind of surprised to meet a 21-year-old who didn't drive. But I understand that to get up to these rural areas is pretty unusual, and it isn't densely populated at all, and everybody pretty much lives in the city.
The oldest living land animal is on the island, and his name is Jonathan. And he is estimated to be 190 years old. And he was actually alive and walking around and drinking water.
Do you see him here? He's a tortoise.
On the left there. A tortoise. This is the town from above. And this is a ladder, a 699 step ladder called Jacob's Ladder. It was a former funicular for freight going from the coast on up to the top of the island. And people do walk that one too. And then that brings us to Namibia, a place that Donald Trump referred to as Nambia while he was president on more than one occasion. And I think he was confusing Namibia and Gambia. But Namibia was a German colony that the British won in World War II. It is desert. And when I told Mary Jo, well, we have a chance to go out in the desert, she said, oh, I've seen deserts before, but not deserts like this one. And this is actually, this sand dune is actually the symbol of the town that we were in. Namibia is considered to have the cleanest government and the freest press in all of Africa. So it's an interesting place. We did, however, only see places that they wanted us to see. So we're not sure whether what we saw was typical. We were in 2 coastal areas that had significant expat populations and significant foreign visitors.
That the deserts were really interesting. They're the whitest deserts I've ever seen. There's nothing but sand, and it's very white sand. There are 2 deserts in Namibia. One is the desert, the Namib Desert on the coast, and then the Kalahari is on the east. So it makes sense that it is, but I just love Namibia. It was really interesting, and the people were quite nice, and it was clean. After being in Senegal, which was, so much trash and stuff on the streets, that I was just really impressed with how clean Namibia was. And it's not a large country in Africa. It's slightly smaller than South Dakota, but it is considered one of the free countries of Africa, like South Africa. And actually, Namibia has a strong history with South Africa.
This is the town of Walvis Bay, which is Dutch for whalefish, because it was originally explored and settled by the Dutch. This is housing. This is middle-class housing. It's not racially segregated, but probably a good number of the expats from Northern Europe that moved down here are in these houses, along with the local people that are better off. Like I say, this is our only real encounter with wildlife, a tremendous amount of flamingos, and also with local food. We got treated to lunch in a restaurant, and they didn't have things like bread and potatoes, but they also had this delicacy, which they refer to as worms, although they're probably a little more like caterpillars. And they're kind of chewy and taste like chicken, but not a whole lot of flavor.
Guess which one of us did not taste those? Me. And I think treated is too strong to say about those. I thought those looked like some of the worst things to ever eat.
But they're high in protein, so that's good.
Probably healthier than chicken McNugget.
Yeah, I'm
Probably.
sure.
Some hot sauce,
Yeah.
some hot sauce.
Actually, we just got them raw, like well cooked, but at least they weren't alive.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Probably the most interesting part of our entire trip was a trip to the townships. And the township is the name for the ghettos all through South Africa and Namibia, and it was the South African occupation following the liberation from the Germans that caused this, where they relocated all of the local people, all of the blacks, from places that were, kind of good economic areas, and put them out in the desert or out on the outskirts, and built these really bad temporary houses. And that's kind of an overview coming out the edge of the desert is this whole area. You can see on the right a little more detail. No permanent construction is allowed in this area. They're all temporary materials. The idea was to put them out there temporarily in this kind of quality housing and then gradually build up better housing for them. But the reality is that this remains the most affordable housing in a country where a lot of people are poor, and there's still a lot of people there.
And one person I talked to, you can't use concrete blocks or anything in these. You have to use like found materials. And so you see a lot of tin that's blown off a roof somewhere, and pieces of wood that are recycled at best. And the idea, as he said, is it's temporary, and then you get your act together and you move across the highway and build a concrete house or a concrete block house. But there are some people that have lived here for 50 years since it was started and are still there. There are a few people that were moved out by the government into more permanent housing, but it's really populated. There are a lot of people living here.
And although you can't see it from here, there were a few places you could actually look in and look at the streets, and they were clean. It was a great contrast from the Gambia and from Senegal, that even in this poorest area was very kept very well. To the left is the area of better housing, and it's still not great, but better and less crowded, and they do have more permanent materials there. One interesting thing, there were two tribes, two very different tribes in Namibia, and one of them split. A tribe that had a tendency not to wear very many clothes, and at some point during colonialization, a large number of them said, you know, we're going to try to make ourselves more respectable, become part of the economy, you know, just you know, dress up a little bit. And so we encountered both tribes. From the clothed tribe off to the right here, we got a tour of a preschool. And from the other tribe, we got a nice dance. And I have a video of that, but I did not put it in.
It might not meet our standards here in Missouri for
Mary Jo noted that the dances had flat feet, and I had to admit I really hadn't noticed her feet.
but anyway, that's terrible. I think it was pretty interesting, and the preschool was interesting to me because I taught preschool at one time, and I was talking to the teacher here, and she's also the director. And I asked her what books the children were reading to see if they were similar to the books we use in our preschool. And she looked at me very seriously and she said, "Oh, the children can't read." And I said, "Well," she said, "they're just, 2 to 4 years old." And I said, "Well, yeah, I know they can't read, but you have books that you read to them and they look at." And she just looked at me and she said, "Oh, books." And she took me over and she showed me a pile of coloring books. And I saw no traditional books at all in there, which is really interesting to me because I was reading about the statistics on Africa, and they are in education, and they are truly, truly shocking. That I think it's 66% of.
Yes, aren't in school by the time they're 15.
Yeah,
Yeah.
are not in school by the time they're
Yeah.
upper high school level, and that's going to affect all parts of your economy when you have an uneducated populace.
Yeah. Our second stop in Africa, in Namibia, was Luderitz, which is a former German town, and it's a very, very nice place. After World War II, the Germans were expelled, and so a lot of the good houses are now summer homes for Europeans, mostly British.
One of the top products of Namibia is actually diamonds. They have a lot of diamonds that they produce, also some gold. And Namibia is known as one of the most democratic places in Africa. It's a free country in the sense that there are about 10 countries that are considered free countries in Africa. And it got its, I can't think of the right word, but its freedom basically in 1990. So it's a relatively new country. It engaged for about 25 years with bush wars with South Africa before it became its own country.
Yeah, we also learned that one of the techniques used by the colonizers, both the British and the Germans and the South Africans later, was to take advantage of tribal rivalries. And so in the case of the three tribes, they put one of them in really nice housing, one of them in kind of middle area, and one of them in a township that we just saw. And the whole idea was they would be at each other's throats, jealous of what each other, the poorer ones jealous of the richer ones. And apparently this was very common through Africa, taking advantage of tribal rivalries and trying to enhance them and trying to prevent the kind of unity that eventually resulted in revolutions or independence movements, but that was delayed for a long, long time.
The downside about Namibia is it has really harsh winds, and the climate is rather harsh.
On the left here, you'll see again a nice view of the good part of town, and off to the right, where the people that are less well off live, that's kind of out in the desert, it appeared to be about 2 or 3 miles away. Not nearly as bad as what we saw in the Gambia and Senegal, but still not exactly great housing. And as you can see, no greenery whatsoever on that side. And that brought us to Cape Town, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. The University of Missouri has an arrangement with the University of West Cape, which is actually about 10 or 15 miles outside of town, so we didn't get there. Cape Town is beautiful. It's surrounded by mountains on three sides and the ocean on the fourth, and there's just all these stunning vistas all over the place.
A lot of people from Colombia have been to Cape Town, because I've talked to people and they said, oh, I've been to Africa, and you ask where and they say Cape Town or Johannesburg, both in South Africa.
The picture on the right, you might see out in the middle of the water is Robben Island, which is where the prison was, where Mandela and other revolutionary leaders were imprisoned. And as you can see, it's kind of like Alcatraz. You're not going to be able to escape and swim back to the mainland. It's pretty far out there. Beautifully developed streets and parks. The one on the left is like right downtown, and it's not entirely a pedestrian street, but cars are discouraged just by the way it's landscaped. And there are little restaurants and shops off the side.
That's what we should do for downtown Columbia.
Yeah.
That could be Broadway.
We tried to do that, but it didn't work. People had to park in front of the stores.
Oh, I see.
And then off to the right, there's a museum district, and that's in that area, and kind of a big central park, actually, right in the middle of town. The harbor area is just totally upscale, beautiful, great shopping. This is one of maybe a dozen different shopping center buildings down in that area. And then there's the area where we stayed in the traditional downtown, which is actually the traditional African area, where we were, found a hotel and said it was, well, in the marketplace. That sounded good. And it's an African market, and has a lot of the characteristics of some of the other parts of Africa. People fairly aggressive as sellers, some begging, not really in the market per se, but off to the side where there were a bunch of restaurants. People who were apparently homeless would come and, ask for part of the food that you were eating, and ask for the cans and bottles too if you bought a soft drink, because they did have a deposit, and they started getting money off the returns. They were discouraged. In fact, there were signs basically prohibiting panhandling, and they were pretty well ignored. A lot of people thought the downtown area was dangerous. Some people said, if you're even going to go a block away, even in the daytime, you need to take an Uber or a cab. And we found that wasn't true. I think those are the same kind of people that are afraid to go to downtown Columbia at night. But we were very much advised against going out any place outside of our hotel at nighttime. And we basically pretty much stayed in.
It has an interesting history too, with the East India Company. I won't go into that, but if you're interested in that, it has one of the more interesting histories of any place I've ever been. They also have a different word usage than we do. There are some things called basters, which are basically part black, people that are part black and part white. They're called basters. And they have the black population, the white population, and then they have this
Colored colors, they've been
and
traditionally
they call
called.
them colored.
Yeah.
If it has like a black father and a white mother,
Or if they're Indians.
or Indian, and they're called coloreds. So they have the three categories, but they don't mean the same thing as they do in the United States.
Yeah. And during apartheid, the coloreds had more rights, more mobility, more rights to work than the blacks, and the whites were in charge. What was interesting here is that you see what this looked like during the daytime. Every night they took it down, and this is what the same area looked like at night. And we couldn't quite figure out why, if they're afraid of theft. I mean, even the infrastructure of the pipes that they hung their tents on in order to sell things came down at night. Don't know if they're afraid that things are going to be stolen or what. Cape Town still has its bad areas. 30,000 people were displaced out of the neighborhoods they were living in order to create a commercial district and relocated to the place that you see on the right. And so that history, and people are still living there. So that history has not been completely overcome. One question that we had is South Africa considered a developed or an undeveloped country? And the answer is both. On the one hand, you can safely drink the water, eat the food, streets, sidewalks, parks, museums, both public and private buildings are high quality. Upscale shopping centers would be considered above average anywhere in the world. There are strong public and higher education systems. The process to get into the country, passport entry, was efficient and really well run. On the other hand, there's begging, aggressive selling in markets, both in the marketplace that we saw, but also in the stores along the actual streets are also small shops, and people are pretty aggressive trying to sell you stuff in a pleasant way. They're not hostile, but they're really persistent. And we saw inefficiencies that are pretty common in developing countries in both the markets and really in the airport. The airport was really strange. Our gate was like about a third of a mile down from the last area where you could buy anything. It was nothing, not even bathrooms down there, that area, and you had to go through 2 different checkpoints to get between there and the place where there was anything you could buy in the airport. So waiting for a plane. The ATM machines did not accept our credit cards and ATM cards in some places, but not in others. Pretty inconsistent. Quality of a lot of the goods were flimsy. And think about some of the stuff in our hotel, which is a nice hotel, but the chairs, trash cans really were kind of flimsy. And there's a lack of coordinated information. They have a great set of museums, like 12 of them. They're in different places. They're all related, but nowhere was there an explanation of what was where, or how to find them, or map. And again, part of the system we would have expected to have more coordinated information about that.
Yeah.
And they had a cab system that did not universally accept credit cards, which was a big surprise to us. And we ended up with like no money, and the cab driver had to go with us, and we found an ATM that did work, and it was actually get some money out from that. But because basically we were out of cash by that time.
But South Africa is not considered, it's considered one of the free countries in Africa, and it's also considered one of the more economically stable
Yeah.
countries. Of 27 countries classified as low income, the 27 lowest, 23 are in Africa. And I think that really makes a statement. So when you think of South Africa as being one of the richer countries, it still has some poverty.
So what do we get out of Africa? First of all, that we didn't know very much about it. It's still a little bit hard to find stuff about it. There's a lot of desert, not just the Sahara. Much of it is extremely poor. And if you look at a list of the development index or per capita income, or whatever you want to use to rate the economic quality of countries, African countries are mostly at the bottom. And this is even after there's the major decrease in extreme poverty. I mean, extreme poverty has declined over the last 20 years from something like, I think, 25% down to about 8%. And even with all that, you can still see that there's obviously extreme poverty.
Every time you say, and this is from a person who writes about Africa, Richard Dowden, he said, every time you say Africa is, the words crumble and break. And I think that's true. It's really hard to say what Africa is, because you start talking about like we are here, and it sounds like that it's just all poverty and poor and has no personality, but that's not true. It has personality. It has some really nice people, and it was quite interesting. The whole time we were there, Al kept trying to compare it with the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, and I thought that was kind of interesting because he felt like the Caribbean actually was doing better than some parts of Africa that we were in.
Yeah. And when you look at those places, they have similar deficits in climate, health hazards, and disease has been a huge problem in Africa. But the mosquitoes, the malaria, the diseases are also prevalent or were prevalent in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Relatively low agricultural productivity. They've got a lot of land, but in the tropics, the land really isn't very productive. And colonial history in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia and Africa. And the question is, why is Africa in so much worse shape than these other parts of the world that are modernizing fairly quickly and gaining in their economy?
One answer might be conflict, because in the 20 places in the world that have active conflicts going on, 11 of them are in Africa.
Yeah. Our cruise had three really excellent lecturers too. One was about basically political issues. One about the ecology and plants and animals, and one was specifically about African economy. And I asked the economy expert, why is Africa in worse shape than these other parts of the world? And she couldn't answer it. She thought maybe because it was closer to Europe, which made it easier for colonizers to have a heavy hand in terms of control. And so there was less control or less involvement by local people and developing local leadership. Other things that we thought of, there's more tourism, definitely more tourism in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. They're closer, Caribbean, of course, to the US and Canada. Southeast Asia, there's a huge tourist industry in Asia of Chinese. I mean, you think of, and this is one of our surprises in living in China and you think of them as kind of being in one place, and both within China and in the rest of Asia, there's a tremendous amount of tourism among the Chinese. The timing of withdrawal of colonial powers might have made a difference. The nature of pre-colonial societies, more tribes in Africa, I think probably more competition in Africa. I read recently about Southeast Asia, about the Indonesian countries, Indo-Chinese countries, sorry. And there was one tribe or one series of tribes that were mountain tribes and the other were coastal. And there was no conflict. They learned how to trade with each other, but there was really no warfare between those. And in comparison to that, there's been a long history, even predating colonialism, of tribal warfare. And I think the colonial powers found a way to divide and conquer and to promote that, which kept it from developing. And what's often cited is post-colonial leadership in Africa is worse than in probably any place else in the world. A lot of corruption, a lot of people that get into power and stay there for life. But the question is why there and not other places?
Well, it is other places. It's they tried to do it in America. Trump has tried to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not completely weird.
But and just in conclusion, I think we need to pay more attention to Africa. I think to the degree that Trump pays any attention to Africa, in his entire first presidency, he had only 2 African visitors to the White House, and he never went to Africa. But to the degree that will have an interest, or his administration will have an interest, it'll be in what they can get out of Africa and not what we can do to improve it.
He does have an African working with them. That's Elon Musk. He's from South Africa, and he has actually met with the president in Namibia back in September. So there may be a kind of a focus on Africa and a competitive focus, because China and Russia have really put some energy and some money into Africa and trade routes and do a lot of work with Africa. And I think America is well aware of that and is trying to play a little bit of catch up.
So in conclusion, largely due to improvements in medicine and sanitation, Africa's population is the fastest growing in the world, a huge number of young people. And that is in part because of modern medicine, you know, a family might have expected to have lost half of its children by the age of 3 or 4, and most are now surviving. And as a result, you have a huge population surge. But it'll certainly be the world's misfortune if these people grow up in poverty, and the poverty that we've observed here, both in terms of not being able to take advantage of their brain power, their minds, what they could be contributing to the world, but also in terms of what happens when you have a large, restive young population that can't find jobs and lives in poverty. And we've seen a lot in the Middle East, and how that has affected the rest of the world. And you know, we're certainly going to be in danger of seeing that in Africa unless we can find a way to kind of break a cycle of poverty. And the things, you know, where you end up is related a lot to where you start. And for a lot of Africa, they're in a jam, but it makes it very hard to get out of.
Thanks for listening to us today, and we welcome any questions or anything any comments you'd like to make about Africa. But I found it just really interesting, and certainly a place that we need to be more aware of.
There were some questions in the chat. Kathy asked, you mentioned several times that free countries, are those free democratically, like they vote, or free of colonial control by other countries?
No, free press, free elections. Yeah, I mean, there's no more colonialism in Africa. They're all independent nations, or virtually all.
But there are only 10 or so that are democratic, where you have free elections and you don't have people trying to overturn elections, and you have set time periods that people are in power, and they're democracies.
Freedom of the press.
So when I mentioned Namibia, it's a democracy.
Another question in the chat was the water that surrounds Africa. Indian Ocean is on the east side and the Atlantic on the west. Is that pretty well?
Right. Yeah. And obviously there's really only one ocean. I mean, it's all interconnected, but basically the area, it's not Cape Town, but it's an area about 30 miles east of Cape Town. It's considered to be the Cape spot where the Indian becomes the Atlantic.
Okay, interesting. And Dave Failer asked if you saw much infrastructure investment coming from China.
We didn't see it. While President Biden was there, while we were there, and got some coverage in Africa, but not a whole lot of coverage from the American press. And he's been working on transportation from the interior of Africa to Angola, and Angola is really the kind of the major port on the west coast of Africa, and trying to improve that and to increase the amount of commerce. And I did listen to a radio station in Namibia, a talk station, where they're talking about whether that was really going to benefit the African people or only the wealthy, and kind of issues I think occur everywhere where you've got development.
I had a question. I went and put it out there so I wouldn't forget it. When you get, it's more personal though. When you got off the cruise ship and you went wandering around, did you tend to go with organized excursions arranged by the ship, or are you more on your own, getting your own transportation, guides, or that sort of thing? You're on your own for eating?
We did both. We did both. We went on to get way out in the rural areas to see some of those townships we saw. We went on organized trips there because it was hard. Sometimes we rented, at least once we rented a cab on our own and went around and went to some strange areas. But oftentimes we walked off the ship and just walked into the towns and into the center parts and walked around.
Yeah.
So we did all three.
Yeah. We talked to somebody who had been on another cruise ship that had stopped in Ivory Coast, and initially we were looking at that one, but he said, it was so regimented that you weren't even allowed off the bus. You were driven through the country and got a glimpse of it, and they wouldn't even let you interact at all with local population. And I think probably a lot of Africa is dangerous and very not tourist friendly.
But where we went was pretty tourist friendly, and people talked with us, and we asked lots of questions, as you can tell.
I guess English was a standard language.
Mm-hmm. It was.
We have some questions. Mari?
Yeah, if I can get myself unmuted. Thank you. This was really interesting. And I just wanted to comment that I know very little about the differences between all of the different countries in Africa, but I do realize that we tend to talk about Africa, which is a continent, not a country. But I think a lot of Americans have the perspective that it's all kind of one thing. And we don't talk about Asia that way. We know the difference between China and Vietnam, but we don't really know the difference between the Gambia and Senegal or whatever. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective. I also wanted to mention that I think the two factor, when we ask why is Africa the way it is, two things that have to be mentioned is one, that they are very rich in valuable natural resources, which other countries have actively exploited for centuries. It used to be just Europe, but now it's China as well. And then secondly, the role that the Cold War played in destabilizing the nascent democracies, the countries that tried to, some of the countries that tried to establish democracies when the colonial powers pulled out, we actively sabotaged those efforts for fear of communism taking root. And Europe and the US came down on the side of the authoritarian governments rather than democracies, because we were afraid that democracies would be too far left and would allow the entrance of communism. So there's a pretty direct culpability there, at least in some countries.
Those are really good points, and probably didn't emphasize enough the resources that they have. Like in Namibia, they have 40% of the diamond trade in the world. You know, just amazing amount of resources from the ground all over Africa. Not farming or like that, but actual resources that are there.
Yeah, well, the purpose of colonialization in the Caribbean was sugar, basically, and in Asia it was rubber, and in Africa it was slaves and diamonds and gold, and it creates an entirely different set of economic structures, I would guess.
But your points about the Cold War are great. Yeah.
And I also wanted to point out, when we visit less developed countries, one of the things that has stood out to me is, and you mentioned it, is the trash everywhere. And just the fact that there is no system in place in a lot of places. I don't know about the ones you visited, but I know in Central America and Mexico, Southern Mexico, where I've been, there's no system for getting rid of anything. And yet companies are coming in and selling all this stuff in single-use plastic containers and wrappers and all that. And there's no place for it to go. It just goes on out into living space. So
actually, Egypt is the worst we've ever seen in terms of trash, but it was after the Spring Revolution, whatever that was called, and there really wasn't much of a government in place. So I don't know whether that was just an unusual situation or if Egypt's usually like that.
Yeah, I think I was more impressed when I found places that were really picked up and clean, and ladies who were out sweeping their yards, which I found kind of impressive. But part of it is government probably, but part of it is just the whole outlook. You know, do you keep your yard clean or not? Does it matter?
but what do you do with
Culture.
Do you feel
you can clean it up
invested?
out of your yard, but what do you do with it if there's no?
Do you feel invested in the place you live? Do you feel invested in the place you live?
Well, what is the
It's
culture?
part of
Does
it,
it
but
matter? Does it matter?
Part of it is my intentions don't matter if I have nothing to do with the trash that I pick up.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing with that point. I'm not disagreeing with that point. You got no system to put it. But my point was, if you don't have a system, then you're surrounded by people who are not invested in the place they live.
True. Because they don't see it as working for them.
No, I jumped over to Wiki to read up on why Senegal looked like it did. It's a place corrupted by 80 political parties living off of the extraction industries. And otherwise, the people running it don't care what you do. That's why you're free to walk around.
But parts of Africa really look to Senegal. I mean, several of the surrounding countries go to Dakar for everything.
Yeah, that's the main
It's
port in that area.
port in the area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sue,
Hey,
Sue and Herb have a question. Let's,
yeah.
Thank
So,
both of you
Herb?
for reporting to us, but thank you also for visiting. West Sub-Saharan coast of West Africa. And thank you for calling attention to the important diversity of that continent, which makes the United States of America look like pale sameness in comparison.
Well, the diversity really is incredible. And someone said, Amari, I think said, you know, we talk about Africa, but we talk about Vietnam and Thailand and all those other places in Asia as separate places. But there are 54 countries in Africa, which is just blew me away. I had no idea there were that many countries in Africa. And I had no idea how big it was because on maps, it doesn't look that big. But Al explained to me how maps work and why it is actually bigger than it looks.
The projections.
There are a couple of things to add, however, if one's talking about the challenge faced by almost every government of South Africa, Sub-Saharan especially.
Yeah, I thought that
these countries have nothing to do with notions of nationhood.
Yeah.
Boundaries are almost all inherited from past colonialization.
Right.
And much of that, not all of it, coastal cities here and there, including Dakar, which you mentioned, but also some others, popped up early, but not all whole territories. The division of the continent into the boundaries that we know today came as a fruit of the Western European competitive colonialization of Africa after about 1840, in a period of about 60 years. And the British, the French, the Dutch, the German, and the Belgian each got pieces of it. The German, by the way, lost all theirs, not in World War II, where the Italians, who also got part of this, lost theirs, but they lost it in World War I, mostly to the combined effect of British armed forces and South African. South Africa is different in some ways, in part because it had a head start. South Africa was colonized by Dutch and British and others, starting several centuries ago. And it was a comparative powerhouse by the early 20th century, so much so, it had its own armed forces. It was a recognized belligerent in World War I and was an original member of the League of Nations in 1920. The rest of the countries all have to compete inside themselves with the fact that they all have this diverse set of languages, diverse set of ethnicity, and diverse senses of history. And they fight each other over it all the time, within and without.
I think it's interesting, and that's why Namibia is so incredible that it just became a nation in 1990. And as it broke away from South Africa after 25 years of kind of bush wars with South Africa. And I guess on that note, we need to call it a day. So thank you all. We appreciate you listening to us.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
This was awesome. Thank you.
How long did that trip take? You didn't mention that. How long did it take?
22 days.
22 days, followed by a 43-hour travel day back home.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
And yeah, I thought, you know, we've done Africa, that's great. And now I think, well, I wonder if it's different in East Africa. I wonder what it's like in the interior. But again, the length of that travel home is kind of discouraging. But, thanks for listening.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
And that kind of puts a little bug in my ear that reminds me that